It was supposed to be a routine patrol, nothing more than a quiet morning among the trees. The frost still clinging to pine needles, birds just beginning to break the silence of dawn. But what Ranger Eli witnessed deep in the Montana backcountry defied everything he thought he knew about the wild, and about himself. A low growl echoed through the valley, not unfamiliar, but urgent, sharp, a sound no experienced ranger could ignore. Eli stepped off the path, boots crunching frozen twigs, and that's when he saw it. A massive, grizzly bear collapsed near the riverbank, breathing heavily, her shoulder gashed open, her eyes dull with pain. Standing over her, as unreal as it sounds, was a jaguar, out of place, out of range, and out for blood. And in that instant, Eli did something that no manual, no training, no instinct for survival would ever recommend. He ran toward them. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This story will challenge everything you believe about animals and about courage. Eli Thomas had always trusted the silence of the forest, a seasoned wildlife ranger in Glacier National Park, Montana. Eli had spent nearly 2 decades walking those trails, learning their whispers, reading the subtle signs in the snow, and respecting every creature that called the wilderness home. That morning had started no differently. He woke up early. In the ranger outpost, brewed a pot of strong coffee, and checked the snow report. It had snowed lightly overnight, not enough to cover tracks, but just enough to quiet the ground. A perfect morning for patrol. He geared up, holstered his radio, and stepped out into the crisp cold. The sun was just rising over the jagged, white peaks, nothing unusual, until the call came through. Unit 4, we've got a situation near Pine Hollow. Locals reported strange tracks. Doesn't match bear, wolf, or cougar. Might be nothing, but ... Eli pressed the button on his radio copy. I'll check it out. ETA. 45 minutes. He knew Pine Hollow well, remote, steep, and not known for strangeness, but he trusted instinct, both his and nature's. If something was off, the forest would show him. He hiked in, slowly, scanning. The tracks weren't hard to spot, heavy, paw prints, round, powerful. But something was wrong. The pattern wasn't consistent with a grizzly or even a mountain lion. They were longer, more elongated, and they weren't alone. Smaller prints followed beside them, barely perceptible, trembling in the snow. Cub prints, bear cub prints. Eli's chest tightened. A mother and cub, likely moving fast, possibly fleeing. As he followed the trail, he noticed tufts of fur, blonde, matted with blood, and then the sound. It was soft, pained, a whimper, almost a moan, coming from the tree line. Eli dropped to a crouch, hand on his tranquilizer gun, and moved forward. With precision, what he saw made his breath freeze. A large female grizzly lay on her side near a partially frozen stream. Her breathing was shallow, her side torn open in deep slashes. Her paw twitched as if fighting sleep or death, and just beyond her, prowling, in slow, calculated circles, was a jaguar. Eli blinked hard, questioning his own eyes. Jaguars weren't native to Montana. They barely existed north of Mexico, and sightings in the U.S. were almost myth. But there it was, muscular, sleek, golden-spotted, and clearly agitated. It didn't make sense. But this was no time for logic. Eli didn't know what had drawn the Jaguar here. A rogue escapee, maybe trafficked and released, but it had attacked, and it wasn't finished. He had seconds to act. He grabbed the tranquilizer rifle, took aim, and fired. The dart hit the Jaguar square in the hind leg. It let out a guttural roar and staggered, locking eyes with Eli before vanishing into the woods with terrifying speed. Eli didn't chase it. His focus was on the bear. She raised her head slightly, tried to move, then collapsed again. Her eyes flicked open, dark, glassy, but focused. They locked onto Eli's, not with aggression, but something else. Was it fear, or was it trust? Eli knelt slowly beside her. Blood soaked the snow beneath her shoulder. He gently checked her abdomen and froze. She was pregnant, very pregnant, and she had been protecting her unborn cubs. The realization hit him like ice water. This wasn't just an injured animal. This was a mother, nearly ready to give birth, attacked in a place she thought was safe, and now it was up to him. He pressed his radio. Dispatch, I need an emergency team and mobile vet at Pine Hollow. Grizzly, pregnant, severe injuries, were losing time. He looked down again. The bear blinked. Hang in there, girl, he whispered. Help is coming. Asterisk. The cold pressed harder now. Eli crouched beside the grizzly, his gloved hand resting gently on her flank. Her breathing was shallow and uneven, one side of her ribcage barely rising, the other stilled with injury. Blood had stopped gushing, but only because her body had little left to give. Minutes mattered. Every second was a choice between life and death, not just hers, but the unborn cubs inside her. The snow around them had turned pink. Eli could hear the distant whirl of a snowmobile engine, faint at first, then growing louder. He stood and waved his arms in the clearing, signaling the emergency team as they approached. It wasn't just any team. Riding one of the snowmobiles was Dr. Mia Rosario, a wildlife veterinarian who had worked with Eli before during wolf rescues. She was calm under pressure, razor sharp, and always moved with purpose. Her eyes met Eli's for half a second as she jumped off the snowmobile, medical bag already in hand. What happened? She asked, kneeling beside the bear Jaguar. Still can't explain how it's here. Attacked her. She's pregnant, full term, maybe days away. Mia's expression hardened. Then we don't have hours. We have minutes. She quickly checked the bear's pulse, eyes, gums. She's going into shock. If the cubs are alive, we'll need to stabilize her immediately. Or, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The grizzly groaned, an unmistakable, low rumble that echoed between pain and instinct. Her paw jerked forward, digging weakly at the snow. She's still fighting, Eli murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Mia opened a sterile bag and inserted a catheter into the bear's foreleg. Eli held the bear steady, or as steady as a full-grown 400-pound grizzly could be. Fluids were pushed in. Antibiotics followed. Then a sedative, just enough to ease her pain without shutting down her system completely. Another ranger, Tom, laid out an insulated rescue sled. We need to move her, Mia said. If labor starts on its own in these conditions, she and the cubs won't make it. Eli hesitated. Do you think we can transport her safely? No, Mia replied. But keeping her here is worse. They gently rolled the bear onto a thermal blanket. She moaned again, louder this time, but didn't resist. Her eyes flickered open once more, and for the briefest moment, They found Eli's again. It was like she understood. "Hold on," he whispered. "We're not letting go." The ride back to the base clinic was tense and quiet. The snowmobile carrying the sled moved cautiously across uneven terrain, every bump a potential risk. Mia never took her eyes off the bear, monitoring her vitals with calm focus. When they arrived, the ranger station had already been converted into a makeshift operating room. Warm blankets, heat lamps, IVs. Mia and her assistant worked quickly, shaving the wound site, cleaning the gash, stitching the torn muscle and skin. Eli stood back, watching, helpless but present. Then it happened. The bear began to stir, not from pain, but from something deeper. Mia paused. "She's going into labor." The room went still. None of them had expected it to be this soon. Mia took a breath. "Everyone quiet. We need to help, but we can't interfere too much. If she's strong enough to push." The bear's muscles rippled. A low, guttural growl echoed from her throat. Not pain, but effort. Her body convulsed once, twice, and then a tiny, wet shape slid out beneath her tail. Fur matted, eyes shut. Still, Eli's heart froze. The newborn cub didn't move. Mia moved forward with practiced hands, gently clearing its nose and mouth. She rubbed its back quickly, stimulating breath. A second passed, then another, then a cough, a squeak, a cry. The cub was alive. Eli exhaled, realizing he'd been holding his breath the entire time. The room relaxed. For one moment, surrounded by heat lamps and hope, a miracle had occurred, and the Grizzly, barely conscious, released a soft exhale. Her eyes fluttered closed. She had done her part. Now it was their turn to make sure it wasn't in vain. The ranger station had gone quiet. The cub's tiny cries echoed softly, bouncing off the wooden walls like fragile notes from a distant instrument. Dr. Mia Rosario wrapped the newborn in a heated towel and placed it gently in a padded incubator. Nearby, under a focused heat lamp, its breathing was thin and fluttery, like a candle barely catching a flame. "She made it," Eli said, barely above a whisper. But Mia didn't answer right away. Her focus was back on the mother Grizzly, who was still unconscious, her breathing shallow, labored, blood loss, trauma, exhaustion. Even with the emergency treatment, her body had limits. "She's not out of the woods yet," Mia finally said. Literally or figuratively, Eli stood near the doorway, watching the snowfall outside dim under the early morning light. Every few minutes, he'd glance back at the bear and the cub, as if needing to verify that this moment, this improbable, almost sacred moment, was real. Then Mia's assistant, Leo, called out, "Her vitals are changing. Heart rate rising, contractions." Eli turned. "Another one, possibly," Mia said, already leaning in, gloved and alert. "Grizzlies typically have 2 or 3 cubs. She may not be done." The room shifted into quiet urgency again. The bear stirred a twitch in her shoulder, a heavy breath, then another contraction, stronger this time. The sound she let out wasn't a growl. It was something ancient, vulnerable, almost mournful. Eli stepped closer, quietly, respectfully. He knew this wasn't a moment for interference, just presence. Witnessing another cub was on the way. It was surreal. The room smelled of antiseptic and wet fur, heat and blood. There were no television cameras, no nature documentaries, just people and one mother bear trying to survive long enough to bring new life into the world. Minutes passed. Then it happened again, another ripple of motion through her belly. The second cub came slower, more awkwardly. Mia moved quickly, but carefully. The umbilical cord was tangled around one of its legs. Come on, she whispered. Not to anyone else, just the life in front of her. Eli saw something he'd never forget. A trained, logical scientist, whispering like a mother, willing that tiny spark of life into the world. Then breath. The second cub let out a sharp, throaty wail, stronger than the first. She's fighting, Mia said, smiling for the first time. She's strong. The mother bear was still unconscious, her body nearly spent, but her cubs, both now cleaned and warm, were alive. Eli leaned over the incubator, watching the two tiny bodies shift and squeak. One lifted a paw, the other yawned. Their eyes were sealed shut, but they were searching instinctively, unknowingly for her, for their mother. Do you think she make it? He asked. Voice tight. Baa hesitated. I don't know. She's hanging on, but barely. These cubs need her. Eli stood up straighter. Then we don't stop. We don't give up. He turned to Leo. Call headquarters. Get any extra field medics available. Supplies. Food for her. A wildlife vet with bear nursing experience. If there's one in the entire damn state. Leo nodded and disappeared out the door. Mia watched Eli for a moment. This man who had once considered quitting the ranger service after a poaching accident, now fighting harder for this bear than most people would for each other. She trusted us, he said, almost to himself. She didn't run. She laid down. She knew. There was no reply. None needed. Outside, the wind howled gently over the clearing. Inside, 3 hearts beat where only one had been expected. 2 cubs lay curled together, breathing in sync, and their mother. Her chest rose, just slightly, as if somewhere in the fog of her unconsciousness, she too had heard her cubs' first cries. The ranger station had transformed into a sanctuary. Outside, snow piled slowly across the trees, softening every sound. Inside, the soft hum of medical equipment and the occasional rustle of blankets filled the space with quiet urgency. The mother bear still hadn't regained consciousness. Her breathing was irregular, and her wounds remained a looming threat. Eli hadn't left her side. Wrapped in a thick flannel jacket, he sat cross-legged just feet away, watching her breathe, sometimes shallow, sometimes deep. He tracked every rhythm, not with a chart, with his gut. He wasn't trained for this, not really. Not to care this deeply, not about a bear, but she had trusted him. And now, with her 2 cubs squirming in a padded incubator near the fireplace, he felt that trust pressing down on him like gravity. Mia moved quietly around the room, checking for lines, adjusting heating pads, monitoring the cubs. The second cub, the one with the tangled cord, was smaller but vocal. She would nuzzle against her sibling, emitting soft whines in search of warmth. The first, slightly bigger, was calmer, still observant. They're bonding, Mia whispered, stepping beside Eli. Like they already know each other, he replied, eyes not leaving the mother. They were born minutes apart, but it's like they're syncing. It's instinct, she said. But it's also something else. Bears don't just live, they feel. Eli turned. You sound like one of those nature poets. She smiled faintly. Maybe I'm just sleep-deprived. He chuckled, but the sound barely held. I can't shake it, Mia. That moment, when she came out of the trees, she knew she wasn't panicked. She didn't attack. She just laid down, right in front of me, as if she'd been waiting for someone. Mia nodded slowly. Maybe she was. They fell into silence again. Time stretched. Hours passed. Just after midnight, Mia stepped outside to make a call. Eli was left alone with the bear. A gust of wind tapped at the window. One of the cubs stirred, and then a sound. Not from the cubs, from the mother. A low rumble, faint and distant, like thunder caught in her throat. Her paw twitched. Her breathing changed, more labored, but deeper. Eli knelt down. "Come on, girl, You made it this far." The rumble grew. Her eyes didn't open, but her body shifted, as if fighting through layers of fog. The foreline shook slightly as her leg jerked. Then, at last, her eye opened. Just one, glossy, dark, and full of exhaustion, but alive. Eli barely breathed. "You're awake." The bear didn't move, but her gaze flicked past him, toward the soft whines of her cubs. "They're okay," he said gently. "They're alive because of you." She blinked, slowly. Then her eyes closed again. Not unconscious, resting. Relief flooded him like heat. He leaned back against the wall, exhaling for the first time in what felt like hours. Mia stepped in a moment later, and he gave her a nod she instantly understood. "She's awake." He nodded. "She's still in there." Together, they watched her settle into a rhythm, still frail, still on the edge, but breathing and listening. Eli looked at the cubs again. The smaller one yawned, her tiny tongue pink against her fur. The larger snuggled deeper into the warmth. "Do you think she'll be able to nurse?" he asked quietly. Mia tilted her head. "If her strength returns, maybe. But even if not, we'll find a way." "No," Eli said, almost stubbornly. "She has to. Those cubs need her." Outside, the wind had died. Inside, hope returned, not as a roar, but as a whisper. Asterisk. The next week passed like something between a dream and a vigil. Every day brought a small change, a stretch of the mother bear's paw, a stronger cry from one of the cubs, a glimmer of recognition in her eyes that grew clearer with each. Sunrise. Eli had all but moved into the ranger station. He slept in short bursts on a cot near the fireplace, waking at every shift of fur, every soft grunt or paw scrape. Mia brought supplies daily: blankets, fresh milk formula, wildlife supplements, but more than anything, she brought calm. She was good with silence, which Eli had grown to respect. The bear, now affectionately called Rosa, after Eli's grandmother, had become something more than a guest. She was the station's heartbeat, the center of it all. The one morning, as golden light poured through the east-facing windows, Rosa stood not fully. Her back legs trembled, and she leaned heavily on her front paws. But it was enough. Eli jumped up from his chair. "She's trying," he said aloud, though no one was there. The cubs, now fuller and more agile, scrambled toward her like magnets to steal. Rosa turned her massive head, lowered her snout, and gave each one a gentle nudge. It was the first time Eli saw her act like a mother in full strength, not just surviving, but parenting. Later that day, Mia arrived with more than just supplies. She carried a clipboard and a tight expression. "I heard from the main office," she said, not meeting Eli's eyes. "They're sending a recovery transport team." Eli froze. "For what?" "For her and the cubs." Mia replied softly. They want them transferred to the regional wildlife center. Full medical facilities, better monitoring, controlled conditions. Eli's throat tightened. He looked over at Rosa and her cubs, now curled in a furry pile near the fireplace. They'll tranquilize her, he said flatly. They have to. No, Eli said, shaking his head. That's not the way. Mia put down the clipboard. Eli, I know what this means to you, but it's not about us. This is about what's safest for her and those cubs. He looked away. Outside, snow had begun falling again, soft, silent. I know, he whispered. That night, Eli didn't sleep. He sat beside Rosa, watching the firelight dance on her fur. The cubs twitched in their dreams. Rosa watched him with deep, ancient eyes, eyes that held something close to understanding. You trusted me, he murmured, and now I have to trust them. He placed a hand lightly on her side. Her breathing was steady. The next morning, the transport arrived, a van with the Wildlife Center logo, a small team of professionals with gentle voices and slow movements. Mia stood beside him. She hadn't slept either. The team worked quickly. Rosa was sedated carefully. Eli held the cubs as she was lifted onto a thick stretcher. She didn't fight. She didn't flinch. Before they closed the van doors, Eli stepped forward and touched Rosa's paw. Thank you, he said. A quiet rumble, not quite a growl, vibrated through her chest. Then she was gone. The station felt too quiet afterward. The fireplace still burned. The cot was still unmade, but the heartbeat was missing. Later, that day, as he packed up the incubator and stacked the empty bowls, Mia placed a note on his desk. One line only. You saved a life because you listened. Eli sat for a long time in the empty ranger station, listening. And then, just before sunset, a soft sound came from outside. He stepped out onto the porch. In the snow, fresh tracks. Large, steady gait. Leaving, not returning. Not Rosas, but a bear. Asterisk. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. The ranger station stood like a sentinel in the snow, its windows reflecting the pale winter light. Eli remained, but the rhythm of life had changed. No soft growls, no scampering paws, no Rosa, no cubs, just echoes. He'd become used to listening for them, the tiny changes in breath, the shuffle of fur on old blankets, the soft gurgle of warmed milk in bottles. But now the sounds were gone, replaced by a stillness that settled in his bones. Eli didn't regret it. He couldn't. Rosa and her cubs had a second chance, and that was everything. Still, it hurt. He busied himself with repairs, restocking supplies, and writing long notes in the station's wildlife journal. He documented everything. Rosa's arrival, the cubs' condition, their healing, and the goodbye. One evening, a radio call crackled through. Station 8, this is Wildlife Medical. Do you copy? Eli sat up straight. Go ahead. A pause. Then, Rosa's stable. Cubs are thriving. We'll send you photos. Eli let out a breath he hadn't known he was holding that night. For the first time in days, he slept. A week later, a padded envelope arrived by airdrop, addressed to Eli, hand-marked. Rosa plus cubs. He opened it slowly. Inside were 4 glossy photos. In the first, Rosa lay in a straw-lined pen, eyes closed but peaceful. A cub curled on each side. The second showed her upright alert, a fish in her mouth. The third was blurry, both cubs chasing a ball of hay, teeth bared in miniature playfighting, and the last, Rosa, sitting tall behind her cubs, eyes forward, watching. Just like that first night on the porch, Eli smiled, but it hurt. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. Reverence, maybe. He placed the photo on the wall beside the fireplace, not as a trophy, as a reminder that not all miracles look like lightning or fire. Some come wrapped in fur and silence. With claws dulled by trust, spring melted the snow. Streams flowed again. The forest breathed green. One morning, while repairing a section of the trail near the station, Eli stopped short. A branch had snapped somewhere nearby. Not wind, not bird. He looked around, slowly, quietly, and there, far off, between trees, thick with moss and budding ferns, a figure stood. A bear, but not Rosa, larger, older. She watched him for a moment, then turned to smaller shapes, followed, clumsy, playful, familiar. Eli's breath caught. The cubs were growing, and Rosa had brought them home, not to stay, just to show him they made it. He didn't wave, he didn't speak, he didn't move. Some things are too sacred for words. They disappeared into the trees, silent as snow, but the echo remained in the cleared space by the station, in the journal entries, in Eli's chest. Echo of wild hearts, stitched together by trust, by instinct, and by the kind of courage that doesn't roar, but watches, waits, protects, the kind that saves. A woman did something no one could explain. She risked her life, not for a person, but for a predator. What happened next? No one expected it. Not the rangers, not the biologists, and certainly not the woman herself. Because when she reached into danger, something ancient reached back. But this isn't some fantasy. This story is real. And what the grizzly bears did next, it shook even the most hardened wilderness veterans. If you think you've seen it all, think again. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This story will challenge what you believe about animals and about love. Asterisk. The forest, thick with dew, and the musky scent of bark and pine needles, stirred slowly to life. Birds chirped. A light mist floated low to the ground, and then silence, not peace, silence. The kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. The kind nature uses when something isn't right. Emma Turner felt it before she saw it. She had been walking the forest path, part of her daily patrol as a conservation volunteer near Glacier National Park. Her boots were soaked, her jacket zipped tight, and her backpack carried only the essentials: radio, notebook, thermos, and a snake hook. She never expected to need it today. And then she heard the rustle. It wasn't the soft flutter of birds, nor the scamper of a squirrel. It was slower, heavier, intentional. She crouched low, heart thudding. From behind a fallen log, up ahead, massive shape was coiled, unmistakable, even from a distance. A snake, not a native garter, not even a bull snake. This was a python, Burmese, at least 15 feet long. Impossible. These snakes didn't belong here. They weren't native to Montana. This was miles and miles from their typical climate. Someone had let it loose. Or worse, it had made its way into the ecosystem, undetected. Emma moved closer. That's when she saw it, a twitch beneath the python's coiled mass, a shape struggling. She couldn't believe it. Caught beneath the snake's crushing grip was a small animal, half smothered, its legs kicking weakly. For a split second, she thought it was a dog, a dark, thick-coated pup, but it wasn't. It was a grizzly bear cub, maybe 6 months old, alone, whimpering. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Logic screamed at her to back away. This wasn't her fight. A python, here in Montana, wrapping itself around a grizzly cub. It wasn't just unnatural, it was deadly. And where there's a cub, there's a mother. Her eyes swept the tree line. Nothing, no movement, no growl. But her feet didn't move. She couldn't walk away, not from this. She reached slowly into her pack, pulled out the snake hook. It was a flimsy thing compared to what lay before her, but it was all she had. Its muscular coils tightening, and then the cub cried out. It was the kind of sound you never forget. Not quite human, not quite animal, a scream of pain, fear, and confusion. Emma didn't hesitate. She jammed the hook beneath the coil and pulled with everything she had. The snake lunged. Her heart stopped. But in that moment, that exact second, the forest exploded. From behind the ridge came a sound like thunder, a roar, deep, guttural, ancient. The mother grizzly had arrived, and she was running. The rain had stopped, but the forest held its breath. The leaves dripped quietly, and the trees, tall and ancient, stood like silent witnesses to what had just unfolded. Julia sat on a moss-covered rock beside the massive python, her breathing shallow, her hands trembling. The snake was still, its body stretched out along the muddy trail, tongue flicking weakly, eyes half-lidded in exhaustion. She hadn't thought of herself when she untangled the net. She hadn't thought of the warnings, or the fact that no one was nearby to help if something went wrong. She had only seen pain raw, instinctive, and had acted, but now, in the aftermath, the adrenaline was fading, replaced by the weight of what had just happened. The python, close to 20 feet long, had gashes where the wires had torn into its thick, patterned scales. She had tried her best with the supplies in her field bag, saline water, gauze, gloves, but this was no ordinary rescue. What she didn't know was that she was not alone anymore. From the ridge above the clearing, 2 dark figures watched, silent, still, grizzly bears. A mother and her nearly grown cub had emerged from the thicket minutes earlier, drawn by the scent of blood and the unusual sounds that echoed through the forest. Their fur was slick from the earlier rain, and their dark eyes scanned the scene below. Julia bent over a predator that, in the wild, was rarely a direct threat to them, but now reeked of vulnerability. The mother bear did not snarl. She did not move. She simply stood, muscles taut, watching. Julia stood up slowly, wiping her forehead with a shaking hand, unaware that she was under observation. She took a cautious step back from the python and pulled out her radio. Static, nothing. The signal here was always weak, and the mountains didn't help. "I need to get help," she whispered to herself. But she didn't want to leave the animal alone. Not after it had fought to survive. Not after it had trusted her enough to let her touch it, dress its wounds, sit beside it. She crouched again and placed a hand gently on the thick, cool body. The python flinched, then relaxed. Its breathing was slower now, steady. At the ridge, the cub took a step forward, sniffing the air. The mother placed a paw in front of her offspring, a quiet command to wait. Julia, gathering her things, heard the soft crunch of leaves to her left. Her breath caught. She turned her head slowly. Nothing, but the forest was no longer still. Something had changed. The mother bear was moving now, slow, deliberate steps down the incline. Her breathing was controlled, but her eyes remained locked on Julia, protective, measured. The cub followed, more cautiously. When Julia saw the first glint of brown fur, she froze. Her pulse roared in her ears. A bare dot, then another. But they weren't charging. They weren't growling. They were ... approaching. ... Julia did not move. She knew better than to run. She lowered her head slightly, body turned sideways, non-threatening. She'd studied grizzlies for years, but nothing in the textbooks had prepared her for this moment. As the bears stepped closer, recognition, empathy. The mother bear sniffed the air, lowered her head, and huffed softly. Then she sat down, just like that, 10 feet away from the snake and the woman who had saved it. Julia's heart hammered in her chest. What was happening here, and why did it feel like this moment? This quiet standoff between predator, protector, and healer was something the forest itself had been waiting for. The forest had gone eerily quiet. No birds sang. No squirrels rustled in the trees. Even the wind, which had whispered through the pines all morning, had stilled. Julia stood still as stone. 10 feet in front of her, a full-grown grizzly bear was seated, not standing, not posturing, just seated, watching. Beside her, a large cub paced slowly, sniffing the ground, occasionally glancing toward the giant python lying in the clearing. Julia didn't understand what she was seeing. The bear's gaze was not filled with rage or confusion. It wasn't challenging. It was ... focused, thoughtful. The kind of stare that said, "I'm trying to understand what this is." And in that moment, Julia realized she was witnessing something no textbook, no field study, no research expedition had ever prepared her for. It wasn't just a meeting between species. It was a reckoning of instincts. The python, still weakened and motionless, raised its head ever so slightly. Its tongue flickered out, tasting the air. Its eyes slit, ancient and calm, locked onto the bear's. There was no strike, no attempt to flee. It knew, just as the bear knew. These were not just animals. These were survivors, beings who had endured hunters, droughts, fires, and floods. They had lost mates, cubs, nests, territory. They had fought and fled and mourned in silence. In this strange circle of mud, moss, and blood, they were equals, stripped of dominance and filled with something deeper. Julia's hands were still trembling, but her breathing slowed. She took a cautious step back and reached into her backpack, pulling out the emergency flare and a small vial of antibiotics. Her eyes remained on the bear as she returned to the python and carefully administered the dose under a small fold of skin. The grizzly blinked. Once, Julia whispered aloud, half to the snake, half to herself, "You're going to live. I promise you." The cub let out a soft whimper. Not fear, not hunger, curiosity, the kind a young child might show in the presence of something they don't understand, but know is important. And then, from the forest's edge, a crack. Julia turned, alarmed. A branch dot, then another dot. Voices, human dot. 2 men appeared, moments later, through the underbrush, carrying gear and walkie-talkies. Rangers. One of them was Miguel, the local wildlife officer Julia had radioed days ago. Behind him was Tobias, a rugged tracker from the nearby sanctuary. They froze at the sight. Julia crouched beside the snake, motioning with her hand, "Don't move." but it was too late. The cub turned first, startled. The mother bear rose not to charge, but to shield. Her posture changed instantly, defensive, protective. She growled, low, warning. Miguel froze, mid-step. Tobias whispered, "Is that a python?" "What the hell?" "Yes," Julia hissed. "And they're not enemies, right now. Don't ruin this." The moment hung heavy. Julia stood slowly, arms out. "They've been here for nearly 20 minutes. They're not attacking, they're watching." The rangers didn't lower their gear, but they didn't raise it either. Finally, the mother bear let out one deep, rumbling exhale. She nudged her cub back. Then, in a motion so slow and deliberate it felt sacred, she turned and walked back, toward the trees. The cub followed. But before disappearing behind the ferns, the mother bear turned once more. Her eyes found Julia's. There was no snarl, no threat, just ... acknowledgement. A nod from the wild. Julia's throat tightened. She had no words. The bears vanished. The men remained stunned, and the python, barely breathing, shifted its massive head toward Julia, tongue flickering. She sat beside it, pressing her back against a mossy boulder, knees pulled to her chest. That, she whispered to the two rangers, still rooted in shock, was not just nature. That was trust. The hours that followed blurred into a strange stillness, a suspension of time where instinct and empathy mingled in the forest air. Julia, now exhausted but wide awake with adrenaline, remained close to the python, her hand occasionally resting gently on its thick, battered coils. Miguel and Tobias had eventually lowered their gear. They didn't speak much, only exchanged glances and whispered updates on the radio to headquarters, omitting, for now, the full truth of what had just occurred. How could they explain it? Who would believe it? The python was alive, barely. Its body showed signs of internal bruising, shallow cuts, dehydration. The antibiotics had helped stabilize it, but Julia knew the next 24 hours were critical. She had never treated a snake of this size in the wild, certainly not under the gaze of grizzly bears. And the bears were gone, or so they thought. As twilight deepened and the forest shifted into the hush of evening, Miguel walked the perimeter while Tobias set up a small camp. Julia brewed pine tea over a small fire, more out of ritual than thirst. Then came the rustling, not the hurried scurry of rabbits or the stomp of deer. This was measured, slow. Miguel froze mid-step. Tobias reached for his flashlight, but Julia raised a hand. Wait. From the same clearing the grizzlies had vanished in 2 hours earlier, a shadow emerged. Not both bears, just the mother. She returned alone. There was no aggression in her posture. Instead, she sat again, like before, quiet, watching. Julia stepped forward, breath caught in her throat. The python, though still unmoving, flicked its tongue, sensing her nearness. And then, something remarkable happened. The bear lay down, no growl, no sign of fear. She rested her massive head on her paws, exhaling deeply. Not weakness, permission, Miguel whispered. She came back, to stay. Julia didn't answer. She sat across from the bear, no more than 10 feet separating them. Between them lay the injured snake, a symbol of everything unnatural, everything feared. And yet, this bear had returned not to hunt, but to witness. It was as if something had been acknowledged. Julia had saved a predator. The bear had watched, and now, perhaps in some untamed way, She was choosing to protect them both. Night fell in a blanket of indigo and stars. The campfire crackled. The forest resumed its rhythm. Distant owls, the chirp of crickets, the flutter of bats overhead. Julia barely slept. Each time her eyes drifted closed, she jolted awake, worried the snake might take its last breath, or the bear might change her mind. But neither happened. In the early light of dawn, when the mist still hugged the ground and the air smelled of pine and dew, something stirred beside the boulder. The python moved. Not much, just a shift. A coil tightened. Its massive head lifted inches off the ground, and its dark eyes opened fully for the first time. It was alive. Miguel saw it first. Is it, trying to move? Julia nodded, stunned. It's stronger. The snake moved another inch, then another, slow but deliberate. It flicked its tongue toward the bear, and the bear, stood. Julia, tensed. But the bear simply looked, calm, steady. She took 2 steps forward, closer than ever, and lowered her head, sniffing the earth near the snake. Then, with a low grumble, she turned and disappeared into the trees one last time. This time, Julia knew it was goodbye. Whatever unspoken pact had existed here was complete. The python had survived, and the bear had borne witness. The air was heavy with tension. Rosa sat beside the massive python in the barn, its breaths now longer and more stable. Her hands trembled with exhaustion, and her clothes were streaked with mud and blood. Yet her eyes remained focused on the horizon, where the shadows of the tree line pulsed gently in the wind. A single movement caught her attention. From between the tall spruce trees, a large silhouette stepped forward, broad, powerful, and eerily silent. It was a grizzly bear, not the same one from earlier. This one was larger, older, with a coat flecked by time and eyes sharp as a glacier's edge. And he wasn't alone. 2 more bears emerged. Behind him, one limping slightly, the other younger, more hesitant. They advanced slowly, but without aggression, as if summoned not by hunger, but by instinct, as if they had heard the forest's cry for something deeper than prey. Rosa didn't move. She barely breathed. Inside the barn, the python let out a low, drawn breath, its coils twitching lightly. The scent of blood was thick in the air, but so era a different kind of scent trust, built on action. The bears stopped just meters from the barn. The oldest of them lowered his head toward the open door. A moment passed that felt like a century. The python lifted its head weakly and looked at the bears. No hissing, no fear, only stillness. Then what no one expected. The lead grizzly sat, simply sat, his massive form folding slowly into the earth, as though he were a silent witness to something larger than himself. The others followed, forming a quiet half-circle around the barn. Rosa's eyes welled with tears, not from fear, but from something deeper, an overwhelming sense that she was part of a moment that defied logic, a moment that spoke to the soul. Behind her, she heard the crunch of gravel. Enrique and Mateo were back, speechless as they took in the sight. The python, 3 grizzlies, and Rosa united in silence. No one spoke. Nature had its own language now. For the rest of the day, the bears stayed. They didn't come closer. They didn't growl. They watched, waited, breathed with the earth. When the sun began to sink and the first cold breath of night drifted in, one by one, they disappeared into the trees, not like animals retreating, but like spirits returning to the wild, after offering something sacred. Rosa collapsed that night in her bed, sleep stealing her quickly. But her dreams were vivid of fur, of scales, of breath, and heartbeats sinking in impossible harmony. In a world that often demanded separation, she had witnessed unity, a unity born not of reason, but of choice. And deep in the woods, the trees held that secret, waiting for the next soul brave enough to listen. Asterisk. It had been 3 days since the bears' silent gathering. Rosa couldn't stop replaying the moment in her head, those massive creatures, watching over the python she'd saved, without violence, without fear. It was as if the forest itself had acknowledged her act and offered a rare response, respect. But peace never lasts long in the wild. That morning, Enrique returned from checking the far traps with a deep crease in his brow. "There are new tracks," he said. "Human, big boots, heavy steps, at least 2 of them." Rosa's heart sank. "Hunters or poachers," Mateo added, tightening the strap on his old field bag. "And they're close." The python, now stronger, was still recovering in the barn. Its long body stretched along hay and blankets Rosa had laid out. The wound was sealed, the bleeding gone, but the serpent remained vulnerable, especially to humans who wouldn't understand what had happened here. That afternoon, they heard the engine, an old diesel truck, groaning up the dirt road. Rosa stepped outside, flanked by Enrique and Mateo, both now carrying rifles, not pointed, just prepared. 2 men got out of the truck, both in full camo, with expensive gear and expressions that told Rosa everything she needed to know. "They weren't hikers. We heard rumors," the taller one said, stepping forward. "A massive python seen in this area. Some locals said a bear was guarding it. Thought it was a joke." "No joke," Rosa said flatly. "She's recovering. She's not a threat." The shorter man gave a cruel laugh. "You saved a python. You must be out of your mind, lady." Enrique took a single step forward. "You're not taking her. We're not asking." But before any further word could be spoken, a deep rumble echoed from the forest. Rosa turned, her breath caught. From the shadows of the trees, the older Grizzly emerged again, this time not alone. 4 more bears followed behind, some of the same ones from earlier, and others new. Their movement was deliberate, controlled, protective. The poachers froze. "Is that ... normal?" one of them whispered, visibly shaking. "No," Mateo muttered, lowering his rifle. "Not even close." The bears didn't attack. They stood in a broad arc behind the barn. Their presence wasn't a threat. It was a warning. Rosa stepped toward the men, calm but firm. "Go." The taller man hesitated, but the sight of 5 bears in full view, silently guarding what should have been a predator, was too much. He turned. Without a word, they got in their truck and drove off, dust rising behind them like the last breath of a defeated thought. Only when the truck was long gone did the bears begin to move again. The old one, Rosa, now called him Bruno, in her mind stayed behind a moment longer. His eyes met Rosa's. Not fear, not curiosity, recognition. And then he disappeared into the trees. Rosa exhaled. Her hands were trembling that night. As the stars returned to their places above the Alaskan sky, she sat beside the recovering python once more, whispering softly, "You're not alone anymore." The days after the confrontation with the poachers were quiet. It was as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting to see what would come next. The python, whom Rosa had taken to calling Sombra for the way her patterned skin disappeared into shadow, was healing faster than expected. The wound had closed. Her eyes were alert. She no longer flinched when Rosa approached, but Rosa knew what had to happen. Sombra didn't belong in a barn. She didn't belong in captivity, no matter how temporary or safe. The python was a creature of the wild, of instinct, of purpose. Rosa had saved her, but now she needed to let go. Early one morning, Rosa, Enrique, and Mateo loaded the crate into the back of their old forest utility vehicle. It wasn't a far drive, just a few kilometers into the untouched valley where the python had first been spotted. A shallow stream ran through the area, and dense underbrush provided shade and hunting cover. It was perfect. As they lowered the crate near a mossy rock, Rosa hesitated. The door latch sat under her fingers, cool and metallic. She looked at Sombra one last time. The python's head lifted slightly, golden eyes meeting hers. Rosa whispered, "You don't owe me anything. Just stay alive." She opened the latch. Sombra didn't bolt. She slid forward slowly, cautiously, tasting the air. Then, with a long, muscular ripple, she moved toward the thick brush, disappearing one coil at a time until the last gleam of her tail vanished beneath the ferns. Gone. For the first time in weeks, Rosa felt alone, but it didn't last long. There was movement among the trees, slow, deliberate. Bruno, the old grizzly, stepped out of the forest like a memory made flesh. He approached the area where the python had disappeared, sniffed the ground, then turned his great head toward Rosa. Enrique whispered, "He's looking for her." But Rosa shook her head. "No, he already knows she's gone. He's saying goodbye." Bruno stared at them for a long, still moment. Then, in the gentlest gesture any of them could have imagined, he dipped his head low, respectful, slow. Rosa's eyes welled up with tears. A bear, a python, a human. None of them should have trusted one another. None of them should have survived together. And yet, they had. Rosa reached for Enrique's hand without looking, squeezing it tightly. "I don't think this story ends here," she said quietly. Bruno turned back to the forest and melted into the green shadows. No roar, no growl, just the silent return of something wild and ancient to its home. Back at the cabin, the barn felt emptier, but the forest didn't. It felt fuller. Somehow, like it had accepted Rosa and her companions, not as intruders, but as part of its story. That night, under a sky filled with stars and silence, Rosa sat on the cabin steps. Her eyes were wet, her heart full. Not all love has words. Not all family shares blood. Some bonds are made through acts of compassion and sealed in the wild. That night, under a sky filled with stars and silence, Rosa sat on the cabin steps. Her eyes were wet, her heart full. Not all love has words. Not all family shares blood. Some bonds are made through acts of compassion and sealed in the wild. And if this story moved you even a little, before you go, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. There are stories in this world that we must keep telling, stories of courage, instinct, and impossible compassion. Don't miss the next one.